Margaret Chen pushed her cleaning cart down the long hallway of the Metropolitan Music Conservatory, the wheels squeaking softly against the polished marble floor. It was just past 6 in the evening, and the building was buzzing with an energy she knew all too well. Tonight was the spring recital, the biggest event of the year. She'd been working here for 30 years now. 30 years of mopping floors, wiping down mirrors, and emptying trash cans, while some of the most talented musicians in the country practiced their craft around her. At 52 years old, with gray streaks running through her black hair and hands that had become rough from decades of cleaning solutions, Margaret had become part of the furniture. People didn't really see her anymore. She was just the cleaning lady. And honestly, that was fine with her, or at least that's what she told herself. Margaret made her way to the main concert hall, her usual last stop of the day. The space was magnificent even after all these years. High ceilings with ornate molding, crystal chandeliers that caught the light just right, and deep red velvet seats arranged in perfect rows facing the stage. At the center of that stage sat a beautiful Steinway grand piano, its black surface gleaming under the spotlights. She started arranging the chairs that had been moved during setup, making sure each row was perfectly straight. Her movements were automatic, practiced. She'd done this hundreds of times before. As she worked, she found herself humming quietly. It was something she did without thinking, a habit she'd picked up years ago. The melody flowing from her lips was her own creation, something that had come to her during a late-night shift last week. Behind the stage, she could hear the young performers warming up. Scales running up and down, trills being practiced over and over, the occasional frustrated sigh when something didn't sound quite right. Margaret knew most of these students by sight, though they probably couldn't pick her out of a lineup. They were so focused on their music, on their futures, on impressing the judges tonight. And what a judge they had this year, Maestro Viktor Volkov himself, the famous Russian pianist and conductor, known throughout the world for his incredible talent and his sharp critical eye. People said he could hear a wrong note from 3 rooms away. Students had been preparing for months just for the chance to play in front of him. Margaret had seen him arrive earlier that afternoon. He was a tall man, probably in his mid-60s, with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He'd walked right past her without a glance, his long coat swishing behind him as he headed to the rehearsal rooms. Just another person who didn't really see her. She finished with the chairs and moved on to checking the restrooms, making sure everything was spotless. The conservatory's director, Mr. Peterson, was particular about these big events. Everything had to be perfect. No detail was too small. Margaret took pride in her work, even if nobody noticed. She might just be the cleaning lady, but these halls sparkled because of her. By 7 o'clock, the audience started arriving. Margaret watched from the side entrance as they filed in, dressed in their finest clothes. Designer dresses, expensive suits, jewelry that probably cost more than she made in a year. These were the parents of the performers, the donors who kept the conservatory running, the music critics who could make or break a young artist's career. She recognized some of the regulars. There was Mrs. Hartworth, the wealthy patron who funded the conservatory's scholarship program. The woman wore her money like armor, all sharp edges and cold smiles. She was talking loudly to anyone who would listen, her voice carrying across the hall even as people tried to find their seats. Margaret retreated to the wings, planning to slip out through the back once everything was settled. She had a small apartment waiting for her across town, a frozen dinner in the freezer, and her favorite chair by the window. It was her usual Friday night, but then Mr. Peterson found her. "Margaret," he said, slightly out of breath. He was a nervous man on normal days, but tonight he looked like he might have a heart attack. "Thank God you're still here." Henry called in sick. The night custodian. "We need someone to stay through the performance just in case there's any emergency. A spill? A problem with the facilities, anything." Margaret's heart sank a little, but she nodded. "Of course, Mr. Peterson. You're a lifesaver," he said, already rushing off to deal with the next crisis. So instead of going home, Margaret found herself a small chair in the far corner of the wings, barely visible in the shadows. She had a perfect view of the stage and could see most of the audience too. The lights dimmed and the recital began. The first performer was a young man, maybe 19 or 20, playing Chopin. He was technically good, Margaret could tell that much. His fingers moved precisely over the keys, hitting every note exactly as written, but there was something missing. The music was correct, but it wasn't alive. It didn't breathe. She watched Maestro Volkov in the front row. His face gave nothing away, but he wrote something in the small notebook on his lap. The young man finished to polite applause and took his bow, looking relieved that it was over. Next came a young woman playing Mozart, then another student with Beethoven, then Rachmaninoff. They were all talented, clearly. These were the best students at one of the best conservatories in the country. But as Margaret listened, she couldn't help feeling a little disappointed. They played the notes, but they didn't seem to feel them. It was like watching someone recite poetry in a language they didn't understand. Maestro Volkov seemed to feel the same way. Between performances, Margaret could see him in the front row, his shoulders slightly slumped, his expression weary. He'd probably heard thousands of these recitals over his career. Technically perfect but emotionally empty performances from students who were trained to play, not to create. During a brief pause between performers, Margaret heard the melody in her head again. The one she'd been humming earlier. Her fingers twitched slightly, unconsciously playing the notes on an invisible keyboard in her lap. It was a habit she'd developed over the years, this phantom playing. Her way of expressing what she couldn't say out loud. She'd learned to play on these very pianos, actually. Late at night, after everyone had gone home, she'd slip into one of the practice rooms and teach herself. At first, she could barely manage a simple scale. But over the years, just by listening and experimenting, she'd figured out chords, harmonies, progressions. She'd learned what sounded right and what didn't. Nobody knew about her secret practice sessions. She always made sure to leave before the early morning staff arrived. It was her private world, her escape from the monotony of mops and buckets. The recital continued. More students. More technically perfect but uninspiring performances. Margaret could see the audience getting restless, checking their phones, whispering to each other. Even Mrs. Hartworth, who normally loved being seen at these events, looked bored. Then came intermission. The lights came up and people stood to stretch their legs. Margaret stayed in her corner watching. She saw Mr. Peterson rushing around, making sure the refreshment table was properly stocked. She saw the performers huddled backstage, some looking relieved, others anxiously waiting for their turn. And she saw Maestro Volkov stand slowly from his seat, his face tired. He looked, Margaret thought, like a man who had hoped for magic but gotten mathematics instead. She understood that feeling more than he could ever know. For 30 years, she'd been surrounded by music, drowning in it, but never quite part of it, always on the outside looking in, invisible and unheard. But tonight, that was all about to change. Though Margaret didn't know it yet, her life was about to transform in ways she couldn't imagine. Sometimes the most extraordinary moments come from the most ordinary places, and sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the one with the most to say. The second half of the recital started exactly 15 minutes after intermission, just as scheduled. Margaret watched from her spot in the wings as the audience settled back into their seats, refreshments in hand. The energy in the room felt different now. Lower. People seemed resigned to sitting through more of the same. The first performer after the break was a thin young man with nervous hands. He sat at the piano and launched into a Liszt piece that was clearly beyond his current skill level. About halfway through, his fingers stumbled over a particularly difficult passage, and Margaret winced. The young man powered through, but the damage was done. The magic of the piece, whatever might have been there, was broken. Maestro Volkov made another note in his book. His pen moved slowly, almost sadly. 2 more students performed. Both were good, competent. One played Debussy with decent technique, but no real understanding of the Impressionist style. The other attempted Prokofiev and made it technically sound but emotionally flat. Margaret found herself feeling sorry for them. They'd worked so hard, practiced for countless hours, and yet something essential was missing from their music. She knew what it was. She'd heard it in the practice rooms over the years. The difference between students who played because they had to, and those rare ones who played because the music was part of their soul. These students tonight, they were playing for the maestro, for their parents, for their futures, but not for the love of the music itself. Then came the moment that would change everything. Mrs. Hartworth stood up suddenly, her voice cutting through the polite applause for the last performer. "Excuse me," she called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Excuse me, Mr. Peterson." The director rushed over to her seat, his face already showing panic. Margaret couldn't hear their whispered conversation, but she could see Mrs. Hartworth gesturing dramatically at the stage, at the piano. The woman's face was pinched with annoyance. After a moment, Mr. Peterson walked onto the stage, holding up his hands for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a small technical concern. One moment, please," he hurried backstage, and Margaret heard him talking to the piano technician, a balding man named Frank who'd been tuning pianos at the conservatory for 20 years. "She says it sounds off," Mr. Peterson hissed. "She says the piano isn't properly tuned." Frank looked offended. "I tuned that piano myself this morning. Then I checked it again 2 hours ago. There's nothing wrong with it." "Well, Mrs. Hartworth is insisting there's something wrong. She's one of our biggest donors, Frank. We can't just ignore her." "The piano is fine," Frank said firmly. "Every string is perfect. Concert pitch exactly as it should be." Margaret watched as Mr. Peterson ran his hand through his thinning hair, a gesture of pure frustration. "Then how do we prove it to her? She's making a scene out there. She wants someone to play something to demonstrate the piano is working correctly." "Get one of the students to play," Frank suggested. "They're all nervous wrecks right now. I can't ask them to go back out there for a technical demonstration. And Maestro Volkov certainly isn't going to do it." Mr. Peterson looked around desperately and his eyes landed on Margaret. She felt her stomach drop. "Margaret," he said, walking over to her. "You're always here during rehearsals. You hear the students practice all the time. Can you play something, anything, just to show the piano is working properly?" Margaret's mouth went dry. "Mr. Peterson, I've never performed in front of people." "Please," he said, and there was real desperation in his voice. "Just a simple scale. Anything to satisfy Mrs. Hartworth so we can continue the recital. You know how these wealthy donors can be. If she walks out unhappy, she might pull her funding." Margaret looked past him to the stage, to that beautiful Steinway sitting under the spotlights. Then she looked at the audience beyond, all those people in their expensive clothes, waiting, her heart hammered against her ribs. "I really don't think—" "Just 30 seconds, Mr. Peterson pleaded. "Play a scale, demonstrate the piano works, and you can go right back to your corner." "Please, Margaret." "I'm desperate here." She wanted to say no. Every part of her being screamed to refuse, to stay in her safe, invisible corner. But she looked at Mr. Peterson's panicked face, thought about all the students waiting backstage who'd worked so hard, and heard herself saying, "Okay." Mr. Peterson's relief was visible. He practically dragged her toward the stage entrance. Frank gave her an encouraging nod. "Just play something simple," he said. "The piano's perfect. You'll hear it yourself." Margaret's legs felt like they might give out as she stepped onto the stage. The lights were blindingly bright. She'd cleaned this stage hundreds of times, but she'd never stood on it like this as the center of attention. The audience was a dark mass beyond the lights. Hundreds of eyes suddenly focused on her. She heard the whispers immediately. The confused murmurs. Someone laughed, a short, sharp sound that cut through the air. "Is that the cleaning lady?" a voice said. "Not quite quiet enough. What is this?" another voice asked. Margaret kept walking toward the piano, her worn uniform suddenly feeling like the heaviest thing in the world. Her shoes, practical and scuffed, seemed to echo too loudly on the wooden stage. She was acutely aware of how she must look to these people. The gray in her hair that she couldn't afford to color. The lines on her face from years of work. Her hands, rough and red from cleaning solutions. She wasn't one of them. She would never be one of them. But she was at the piano now, and there was no turning back. Margaret sat on the bench, and it felt both foreign and familiar at the same time. She'd sat at pianos hundreds of times in the practice rooms, but never like this. Never with people watching. She could see Maestro Volkov in the front row now. His expression was unreadable, but she thought she detected a hint of curiosity in those sharp blue eyes. Or maybe she was imagining it. Maybe he was just wondering why a cleaning woman was wasting his time. Margaret's hands trembled as she placed them on the keys. The ivory was cool and smooth under her fingers. She took a breath, trying to steady herself. Mr. Peterson had said to play something simple. A scale would do it. Just run through a C major scale, prove the piano was fine, and get off the stage. But as her fingers touched the keys, something shifted inside her. She'd spent 30 years being invisible. 30 years watching other people make music while she scrubbed floors. 30 years of late-night practice sessions in empty rooms, playing for an audience of none. If she was going to embarrass herself in front of all these people anyway, She might as well do it properly. Margaret closed her eyes. She blocked out the audience, the whispers, the weight of all those watching eyes. She thought about the melody that had been running through her head for weeks now. The one she'd been humming earlier. The one she'd worked out note by note during her secret practice sessions. Her fingers found the first chord. It was soft, delicate, a whisper of sound that seemed to hang in the air. Then the melody began. It started simple, just a few notes that spoke of quiet mornings, of walking through empty halls while the world still slept, of watching the sunrise through tall windows while her hands worked automatically, cleaning, always cleaning. The music grew, building on itself. Her left hand added a bass line she'd figured out by trial and error, notes that supported the melody but also told their own story. The harmony was unconventional, she knew that. She'd never learned the proper rules of composition, but it felt right, and that was all that mattered. The melody shifted, becoming more complex. It spoke of dreams deferred but never forgotten, of hearing beautiful music every day and feeling it seep into her bones, becoming part of her even as she remained invisible to those who made it. There was longing in the notes, but not sadness. There was hope. Margaret's fingers moved faster now, more confident. The trembling had stopped. She was lost in the music. In this piece of herself she was sharing with the world for the first time. She'd never played it all the way through before, had only worked on it in fragments. But now it flowed out of her like water finding its path. The piece built to a climax. Her hands moving across the keys in patterns she'd taught herself, creating harmonies that shouldn't work according to the rules but somehow did. There was pain in the music now. The pain of being overlooked, of having a voice but no way to use it. But there was also strength. The strength it took to keep going, to keep finding joy in small moments, to keep dreaming even when the world told you to stop. And then gradually, the music softened again. It returned to that opening whisper but changed now, transformed by everything that had come before. The final chord hung in the air, resonating through the silent hall before slowly fading to nothing. Margaret opened her eyes. Her hands were still on the keys. For a moment she'd forgotten where she was. The bright lights came rushing back, and with them, the reality of what she'd just done. The silence in the hall was absolute. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Margaret's heart sank. She'd made a fool of herself. She'd played some amateur composition in front of one of the greatest pianists in the world, and an audience full of educated music lovers. What had she been thinking? She started to stand, ready to flee the stage and probably never come back to this building again. But then she heard it. A single pair of hands clapping. Slow, deliberate. Margaret looked up and felt her heart stop. Maestro Viktor Volkov was standing. The maestro was on his feet and he was clapping. The sound echoed through the stunned silence of the concert hall like a crack of thunder. Margaret stood frozen at the piano, unable to process what was happening. Then, like a dam breaking, the rest of the audience erupted. The applause started scattered, confused, but quickly grew into something massive. People were standing now, dozens of them, then hundreds. Their hands came together in a sound that washed over Margaret like a wave. She heard gasps, excited whispers, even what sounded like someone crying. But Maestro Volkov wasn't applauding anymore. He was walking toward the stage. Toward her, Margaret's first instinct was to run. Every cell in her body screamed at her to get off that stage, to disappear back into her comfortable invisibility. But her legs wouldn't move. She could only stand there, gripping the edge of the piano for support as the famous conductor climbed the steps to the stage. Up close, he was even more imposing, tall with sharp features and those piercing blue eyes that seemed to look straight through her. His silver hair caught the stage lights as he approached. Margaret had seen this man from a distance for years, but now he was standing right in front of her, and she couldn't breathe. "Where did you learn this piece?" His voice was deep, accented, commanding. The question wasn't gentle or curious. It was a demand. Margaret's voice came out as barely a whisper. I didn't learn it, sir." His eyes narrowed. "Then where did you hear it? Who composed it?" "I must know," she swallowed hard. Her throat felt like sandpaper. "I composed it, sir. It's mine." The maestro stared at her for a long moment. The audience had gone quiet again, straining to hear their conversation. Margaret could feel hundreds of eyes on her back. "That is impossible," Volkov said, but there was something in his voice now. Not anger, but something else. Confusion, disbelief. "This piece has elements of Rachmaninoff's emotional depth. but the harmonic structure is completely unique. The way you resolved that progression in the third section, it defies traditional composition rules, yet it works. It shouldn't work, but it does. He leaned closer. You are telling me you created this? Yes, sir. Margaret's voice was shaking. I'm sorry if it's wrong. I never had proper training. I play what sounds right to me. Play what sounds right. Volkov repeated the words slowly as if testing them. Then suddenly he turned to face the audience. His voice rang out across the hall. Ladies and gentlemen, I have been judging musical competitions for 40 years. I have heard students from conservatories on 5 continents. I have listened to prodigies who began training at 3 years old. Children born into musical families and raised with every advantage. He paused, and the silence was so complete that Margaret could hear her own heartbeat. But I have never, in all those years, heard anything like what I just witnessed. This woman, who tells me she has no formal training, has just demonstrated something that cannot be taught. Pure, instinctive musical genius. The words hit Margaret like a physical force. Genius, her? The cleaning lady who barely graduated high school, who'd spent her entire adult life pushing a mop. It was absurd. It had to be some kind of joke. But Maestro Volkov wasn't laughing. He turned back to her and his expression had completely changed. The sharp, critical mask was gone. In its place was something Margaret had never expected to see. Respect. How long have you been playing? He asked, his voice quieter now. About 25 years, Margaret said. Maybe a bit more. I taught myself, mostly at night after everyone went home. I'd practice in the small rooms upstairs, the ones nobody uses. 25 years hidden away in practice rooms and nobody knew. Volkov shook his head slowly. What a tragedy. What a waste. The word waste stung, even though Margaret knew he didn't mean it cruelly. But it was true, wasn't it? She'd hidden her music away like a shameful secret, too afraid to let anyone hear, too convinced she had nothing valuable to offer. Play something else, Volkov said suddenly. Margaret blinked. Sir, another piece. Another of your compositions. You have more, yes? Yes, but they're not polished. They're just things I've been working on. Play, he commanded, and there was no arguing with that voice. Margaret sat back down at the piano, her hands trembling again. She had dozens of melodies in her head, fragments and phrases she'd been collecting for years like a magpie gathering shiny objects. She chose one she'd been working on recently, a piece that reminded her of rain. This one started differently, quicker, lighter. The notes danced like water droplets on a window. Her right hand carried the melody, while her left created a rhythm that mimicked the patter of rain on the conservatory's roof. She'd spent many late nights listening to that sound while she practiced. The piece evolved, the rain growing heavier, more insistent. The mood shifted from playful to something more melancholy. She thought about all the rainy nights she'd spent alone in this building, the storms that had kept her company while the rest of the world slept. There was loneliness in the music, but also a strange comfort. The rain was her friend, her witness to all those secret hours. Then the storm passed. The music lightened, becoming gentle again. The final notes were soft, like the last drops of rain falling from leaves after the clouds have cleared. When she finished, the applause came immediately this time. But Margaret barely heard it. She was looking at Maestro Volkov, trying to read his expression. He was smiling, actually smiling. It transformed his stern face completely. Remarkable, he said. You hear the world around you and translate it directly into music. No filters, no learned techniques getting in the way. Just pure emotional honesty. He paused. But I can also hear the gaps in your knowledge. The technical limitations. You have developed your own system, yes? Your own way of understanding harmony and structure? Margaret nodded. I don't know the proper names for things. I just know what sounds good together and what doesn't. Sometimes I'll try something and it sounds terrible, so I'll adjust until it feels right. Instinct, Volkov said. Musical instinct of the highest order. But imagine what you could do with proper training, with an understanding of theory to support your natural gifts. I'm 52 years old, Margaret said quietly. Isn't it too late for that? Volkov laughed, a big, genuine sound that made several people in the audience jump. Too late? My dear woman, Julia Child didn't write her first cookbook until she was 50. Frank McCourt published his first novel at 66. You think 52 is too old to begin? He shook his head firmly. Nonsense. You have already begun. You have been training yourself for 25 years. Now it is time to refine that training." He turned to face the audience again. "The recital will continue shortly. But first I want to make an announcement. This woman, Margaret Chen, has tonight demonstrated something extraordinary. I am offering her a full scholarship to study at the Volkov Institute in New York. She will have access to the finest teachers, the best facilities, and all the time she needs to develop her compositional voice." The audience erupted in applause again, but Margaret felt like the floor had dropped out from under her. A scholarship? To a famous music institute? It was impossible. It was a dream, the kind she'd stopped letting herself have years ago. "I can't," she said, but her voice was lost in the noise. Volkov must have read her lips because he leaned down, speaking directly into her ear so she could hear him over the applause. "You can and you will. We will discuss the details later. For now, take your bow. You've earned it." He gestured to the audience, and Margaret realized he wanted her to bow, like the student performers had done. The idea seemed ridiculous. She was wearing her cleaning uniform, for heaven's sake, but the maestro was waiting, and somehow she found herself bending at the waist, acknowledging the applause that seemed to go on forever. When she straightened up, she caught sight of the students backstage. They were all staring at her, their faces showing various degrees of shock, confusion, and in some cases what looked like envy. These young people who'd trained their entire lives, who'd won competitions and earned their places at this prestigious conservatory. And here was the cleaning lady being offered a scholarship by Maestro Volkov himself. Margaret felt a flush of shame. She didn't belong here. This was their world, not hers. But then she saw one of the students, a young woman who'd performed in the first half, actually smiling at her. The girl started clapping, and soon several other students joined in. Not all of them, but enough. Enough to tell Margaret that maybe, just maybe, there was room for her here too. Maestro Volkov escorted her off the stage himself, his hand lightly on her elbow. Backstage, Mr. Peterson looked like he might faint from shock. Frank, the piano technician, was grinning from ear to ear. "I told you the piano was perfectly tuned," Frank said to Mr. Peterson. Yes, you were right," Peterson said absently, his eyes still on Margaret. "Margaret, I had no idea. All these years you've been here, and none of us knew you could play like that." "It's okay," Margaret said automatically. "I didn't want anyone to know, but why?" Peterson looked genuinely confused. "Why would you hide such a gift?" Margaret didn't have an answer for him. Or rather, she had too many answers. Because she was afraid. Because she didn't think she was good enough. Because people like her didn't become musicians. Because the world had taught her to be invisible, and invisible was safe. But safety, she was beginning to realize, came at a cost. And that cost was never knowing what she might have been capable of, if she'd only been brave enough to try. Maestro Volkov had stepped away to talk with some people from the audience. Important-looking people who seemed excited and animated. Margaret could see them gesturing toward her, asking questions. The maestro was nodding, explaining something. Mrs. Hartworth, the wealthy patron who'd started this whole thing with her complaint about the piano, approached Margaret. The woman's expression was unreadable. "That was extraordinary," she said finally. "I must admit, when I saw you walk onto that stage, I thought it was some kind of joke. But you proved me very wrong." She extended her hand. "I apologize for underestimating you." Margaret shook her hand, too surprised to do anything else. "An apology from Mrs. Hartworth? The woman who never apologized for anything?" "The conservatory should have recognized your talent years ago," Mrs. Hartworth continued. "If you decide not to take Maestro Volkov's offer, I would like to fund your studies here. Full scholarship, whatever you need. Thank you," Margaret managed to say. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll continue playing," Mrs. Hartworth said simply. "The world needs more music like that. Honest music. Music that actually means something." Margaret barely remembered the rest of that night. The recital continued, though she could tell the remaining student performers were rattled. How could they not be? The cleaning lady had just upstaged all of them in front of one of the world's most respected musicians. She stayed backstage, tucked in her corner, trying to process what had just happened. Her hands were still shaking. Every few minutes, someone would approach her. A student asking how she learned to play. A parent wanting to shake her hand. A reporter from the local arts magazine requesting an interview. It was overwhelming. When the recital finally ended, Maestro Volkov found her again. "Come," he said. "We need to talk properly." There is a room upstairs, yes? Private. Mr. Peterson quickly arranged for them to use one of the faculty lounges, a comfortable space with leather chairs and a small kitchenette. Margaret had cleaned this room countless times, but had never actually sat in it. It felt wrong somehow, like she was trespassing. Volkov settled into one of the chairs and gestured for her to sit across from him. "Now," he said, his voice gentler than it had been on stage. "Tell me about yourself. Not about the music. About you." Margaret didn't know where to start. "There's not much to tell. I grew up in a small town upstate. My parents worked in a factory. We didn't have money for things like music lessons." "But you loved music?" "I loved listening to it," Margaret said. "We had an old radio, and my mother would play classical stations while she cooked. I used to sit on the kitchen floor and just listen. I didn't understand it, but I felt it, you know?" Volkov nodded. "Music is a language that speaks directly to the soul. You don't need to understand it intellectually to feel its truth. When I was 16, I got a job cleaning at the local community center. They had a piano in the basement, old and out of tune. I'd stay late and try to figure out how it worked. I taught myself the basics from a book I found at the library." She smiled at the memory. "It took me 6 months to learn a simple scale. And after that, I moved to the city when I was 22, got this job at the conservatory. It was supposed to be temporary, just until I figured out what I really wanted to do. But temporary became permanent. Years passed. I kept telling myself I'd go back to school, find a real career, but life got in the way." "Life often does," Volkov said quietly. "But you kept playing, late at night when nobody was here. It was my escape, I guess, my way of dealing with everything. When my mother got sick, I'd play sad pieces. When I was frustrated with work, I'd play angry pieces. The music helped me process things I couldn't put into words." "And you began composing?" Margaret nodded. "Almost by accident. I'd be playing someone else's piece, and I'd think, what if it went this way instead? So I'd try it. Then I'd add my own section. Eventually, I realized I was creating my own music. It felt presumptuous to call it composing. I'm not a composer. I'm just someone who plays around with sounds." "No," Volkov said firmly. "A composer is someone who creates music. That is exactly what you are. The fact that you lack formal training does not diminish your work. In some ways, it enhances it. You have developed your own voice, uncorrupted by academic conventions." He leaned forward. "But let me be honest with you, Margaret. Your natural talent is extraordinary, truly rare. But talent alone is not enough. To reach your full potential, you need proper training. You need to understand theory, composition techniques, the history of music, not to constrain you, but to give you more tools to express what you already feel." "I'm 52, Margaret said again. It seemed important to keep reminding him. "I'm not a young student with decades ahead of me." "So, do you plan to die next week?" Volkov's blunt question made Margaret blink. "You could have 20, 30, even 40 more productive years ahead of you. Why waste them mopping floors when you could be creating beauty?" "Because mopping floors pays my rent," Margaret said quietly. "I have bills, responsibilities. I can't just drop everything to pursue some dream. It's not a dream. It's your calling." Volkov stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. "I'm going to tell you something I don't share often. When I was young, I was considered a prodigy. I gave my first concert at 7 years old. Everyone said I was destined for greatness." He paused, his reflection in the dark window showing a sad smile. "But prodigies are common. The world is full of technically brilliant musicians who learned young and practiced obsessively. Do you know what's not common? Artists who have something genuine to say. Artists who create music that connects with people on a fundamental level." He turned back to face her. "Tonight during that recital, I was bored. All those talented students playing all the right notes, and I was bored. Then you sat down at that piano, and for the first time in months I felt something. Your music made me feel." Margaret felt tears welling up in her eyes. She blinked them back hard. "My scholarship offer is genuine," Volkov continued. "The institute will cover tuition, materials, everything. You would need to live in New York, but we provide housing for scholarship students. You wouldn't have to worry about money." "I can't accept charity," Margaret said. "It's not charity. It's an investment. I want to see what you can become. Selfishly, I want to hear the music you'll create." He sat back down. "But I understand you need time to think. Take the weekend. Come see me Monday evening and we'll discuss it further." He pulled out a business card and wrote something on the back. "This is my private number. Call me when you're ready to talk. Margaret took the card, her hands still trembling slightly. After Volkov left, she sat alone in the faculty lounge for a long time, staring at the card. The building had emptied out. She could hear the distant sound of doors closing, people leaving, cars starting in the parking lot. Soon she was alone, surrounded by the familiar silence of the empty conservatory. She found herself walking to one of the practice rooms on the third floor. Her practice room, though no one knew she thought of it that way. She turned on the light and sat at the old upright piano she'd used for so many years. Her fingers found the keys and she started playing. Not one of her compositions this time, but a Chopin nocturne she'd taught herself years ago. The notes flowed easily, almost automatically. She'd played this piece hundreds of times, but tonight it sounded different. Or maybe she was hearing it differently. She thought about what Volkov had said about her natural talent. She'd never thought of herself as talented. She was just someone who loved music and had figured out how to play it. Was it really possible? Could she actually do this? Could the cleaning lady become a student? Could she walk into classrooms with people half her age and not feel like a complete fraud? The doubts circled in her mind like vultures. She was too old. She didn't have the right background. She'd never fit in. Everyone would laugh at her. The middle-aged woman trying to have a music career. It was ridiculous. It was embarrassing. But then she remembered the feeling of playing on that stage tonight. The moment when she'd closed her eyes and let the music pour out of her, not caring who was listening or what they thought, just playing for the pure joy of it. She'd spent 30 years being invisible, being safe, being practical, and where had it gotten her? A studio apartment, a job that wore out her body, a life that was comfortable but small, so small. Margaret finished the nocturne and sat in silence. The practice room was shabby, with water stains on the ceiling and a radiator that clanked. But it had been her refuge, her secret place, the space where she'd become herself. She pulled out her phone, old and cracked but functional, and looked at her bank account. She had some savings, not much, but enough to survive for a few months if she needed to. She thought about her apartment, her few possessions, her routine. What would she really be giving up? And what might she gain? The weekend passed in a blur. Margaret called in sick to work on Saturday, the first time she'd done that in years. She spent the day researching the Volkov Institute, reading about its programs, looking at testimonials from students. It was one of the most prestigious music schools in the country. People who graduated from there went on to have real careers, performing with symphonies, composing for films, teaching at universities. Could that be her life? It seemed impossible. On Sunday, she visited her friend Rita, another cleaning woman who worked at a nearby hospital. Rita had been Margaret's closest friend for 15 years. They'd met at a bus stop and bonded over their shared exhaustion. "So let me get this straight," Rita said, pouring coffee in her small kitchen. "This famous musician wants to give you a full scholarship to his fancy school, and you're not sure if you should take it?" "It's not that simple," Margaret protested. "It is exactly that simple." Rita sat down across from her. "Maggie, I love you, but you've been hiding your light under a bushel for as long as I've known you. You're always talking about being realistic, being practical. Well, I'm going to be realistic with you. We're not getting any younger. Our knees hurt. Our backs hurt. How many more years do you think you can push a mop before your body gives out?" Margaret winced because Rita was right. She'd been feeling it more lately, the aches and pains that came from decades of physical labor. "This is your chance," Rita continued. "Your one chance to do something you actually love instead of something that just pays the bills. You think opportunities like this come around every day? You think Maestro, whatever his name is, offers scholarships to cleaning ladies all the time? But what if I fail? What if I can't keep up with the other students? What if I'm not as good as he thinks I am?" "Then you fail," Rita said simply. "So what? At least you tried. At least you didn't spend the rest of your life wondering what if. That's the real failure, Maggie. Not trying at all.